All right, good morning, everyone. This is Friday of National Distance Learning Week, and it is our final presentation. We are really happy to have you here. I'm Erin Maney, and I'm the Manager of Communications and Community Engagement at SUNY Online. And it's my pleasure to be able to introduce our speaker to you today. We will have time for Q&A at the end, but you're welcome to put questions and comments in the chat as we go along, and John and I will be moderating that for you. I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Mária Cipriani. Mária is an adjunct assistant professor who has been teaching online asynchronously since 2016 in the American Studies Department at SUNY Old Westbury and in the English department at CUNY's John Jay and City Tech and synchronously at Farmingdale College's LIEOC since 2020. So I want to thank you to Mária for being here and sharing with us this great presentation today.
Thank you. I don't have to introduce myself. That's great. So I teach around. I've taught a lot of places, and some are better at online learning than others. But actually, I started at City Tech in 2010, and in 2010, my students were being deployed. They were deployed to Afghanistan, they were being deployed to Iraq, and they were being deployed in October and November. And I started to think back then about how they could finish my composition class by accessing it through Blackboard and completing it. And a few of them actually did that, and I was really happy about that. So pre-pandemic, I've been teaching online. I started at the City University in 2013. And I've done a lot of online training. So before I could actually teach an online class, I had to spend a semester per school preparing an online class. In addition, in 2017, I was really lucky to work with a course designer, which taught me a lot more about how to create a learning experience. Because before that, I would walk into a classroom, I could turn on my energy and I could teach, and that was fabulous. But the online, at that point, only asynchronous teaching was very, very different. And so to get that sort of course design idea into my head, which was then reinforced with the PAT program at CUNY, really started me thinking differently about online course delivery. Then I went to the Centers for Tomorrow at Buffalo, which really started thinking about the gamification of teaching. And the point at this conference that I went to at Buffalo was that the educational system has been gamified since we started grading. Students get rewards or points for better performance, and that's a type of game. And at first I was like, oh, I don't like that idea. But the more I was in this conference, the more I realized it's not a bad thing. It doesn't lessen the import or the impact of our lessons. And as I started to acknowledge the idea of gaming, I was able to start thinking differently about my online classes. Again, at this point, they were all asynchronous. And I started to think about them differently. I noticed from 2010 to 2020 that my students were getting younger. They actually weren't getting younger. I was getting older. But they were the same age. I was getting older. And eventually I began to recognize that the metaphors that I used were not theirs. Their experiences, their cultural references, their focuses were different. And I tried to enter their world. With the idea of gamification in mind, I had my nephew teach me how to play Grand Theft Auto, GTA. I was very bad at it. I couldn't drive for a few hours after I played the game. And I asked him, why am I jumping out of the car and punching these people? And so he showed me the storyline. And I thought, wow, that's pretty cool. There's a story. The graphics are fabulous. And it would be fabulous also if I could make a class that looked like this game. It took $250 million to create Grand Theft Auto. They made that back double in a day. So the first day that the game was out, it made $500 million. But it was a thought. And that thought was then reinforced again when I taught a course called Death and Literature as a grad student at Stony Brook. And in Death and Literature, I taught, one of the books that I taught was The Inferno in Dante's Commedia. And my students came up to me after we were reading this book and they're like, "Professor, the book is so much different than the game." And I was like, there's a game. And so I went and I looked at this game. And of course, the irony of that game was there's this strapping Dante who saves Beatrice. Okay. That was pre-pandemic. But the idea of the gaming and the gamification of asynchronous learning had taken place in my head. Then the pandemic happened. I was teaching asynchronous classes that were put on hold for a while people who needed to move to online did that. And now, a couple of years later, we're back to a new normal. The last meeting before the pandemic, I said, I don't normally attend meetings because as an adjunct, that's one of the benefits. I don't have to go to a meeting. But this one I wanted to go to because we were talking about online teaching and online learning. And it was kind of ironic that the very last thing that I was at before the pandemic was this sort of contentious meeting where I said, we need to not be dinosaurs. And apparently I offended some people. I didn't mean to be insulting, but I teach composition as well as literature and some other things. And, when I think about audience and purpose, if we don't know our audience, who are 18-year-olds, 20-year-olds, and non-traditional students, our purpose will be lost. And our purpose, my purpose, is to create independent thinking, creatively thinking individuals who will preserve our democracy. And if that's controversial, it's how I've been teaching online and in person since I started teaching around 2009. And despite this, I love teaching. I love teaching in person. If I could walk into a classroom, I would be happy to do it. I like the challenge of creating an online experience for students, but it's normally an asynchronous one. The Zoom thing is not what I'm used to. It's not what I've been taught, and it doesn't seem to be working in many instances. And I needed to figure out why. So I taught in many different ways, but the Zoom thing wasn't working, and I've not been in a situation where an entire class hasn't worked. There are days when classes don't work, but not an entire experience. And this online Zoom experience was not working for me. So I did some research. And I found out that Zoom was created in 2012. It was created by a former vice president for Cisco who didn't want to travel 10 hours for a 1-hour conference. So his audience was business people and his purpose was teleconferencing. And for that, it worked great. It was a great thing. And during the pandemic for schools, it was a fabulous stopgap. Teachers were forced to prepare an online class in 2 weeks, as opposed to the entire semester that I had to prepare an online class. And so they tried to create the in-person environment in a Zoom as well as possible. And many of my colleagues did a great job and they were very inventive. But this platform was not made for teaching. The conference room is not a classroom. The conference room is not the classroom. And even if we have in a conference one person at the head of the table, it's not the same as a professor. The people sitting around the table are not the same, on the same playing field. And a conference room is not a classroom. More realistically, the conference room is not a classroom. And this is more of what many, many of my colleagues are seeing. In many of the schools where I teach, I'm not allowed to ask students to turn on the camera, and I don't want to. And I don't want to because, especially during the pandemic, people were in very difficult circumstances. Using a camera takes up a lot of bandwidth, and many of my students did not have the bandwidth to give. At John Jay, my students are also in law enforcement and other professional lines of work where they can't be on camera. And so this is often what I get. So I needed to reframe. Something was not right. I did some research, and the last meeting, as I said before, the COVID shutdown, and 2 years post-COVID, we're doing this sort of hybrid thing that doesn't seem to be working. I attended an MLA conference on Zoom recently called Where Do We Go From Here? Remote Teaching. And the presenters, Lee Bissett, Jesse Caton, and Anne-Marie Perez, made some really interesting observations. They said that the campus, the physical campus, is the great equalizer. And as soon as students went off campus during the pandemic, we saw the inequalities. We couldn't help but see the inequalities. We moved we moved online and off campus, and things changed, including that dehumanizing idea of surveilling students to keep them honest while they're taking tests. I learned a long time ago, teaching online, that the best way to test students was to give them the opportunity to keep taking the test until they got 100%. That was a much better learning experience than simply having them regurgitate facts. And it was the kinds of conversations that I heard in the MLA conference, which just happened a couple of months ago, that made me realize that there are different ways to think about teaching online, and different ways to think about the things we use to teach, including tests. So I also teach at Hofstra, and Hofstra is a private college that didn't go 100% remote. It had the funds to be able to provide masks at the door of every room, of every entrance to the building. There was always hand sanitizer around, and they cordoned off sections so that people had distance, social distancing, and screens in front of the professors when they were standing at a podium more than 6 feet away from their students who were in a sort of stadium setup. It was a really nice setup. And yet, because I live with 3 people who are at risk, I came home from teaching every day, sort of paranoid, take off everything in the laundry and throw it into the dryer. It was not an easy time. And I didn't see a lot of people because as an adjunct, I teach at 8 o'clock in the morning. But one day I met a colleague walking back from class, and I want to give her a shout out because she also gave me a different reframe about teaching online. Iska said, I have never taught online. I refuse to teach online, And, good for you, but I'm never going to teach online. And I said, why? What's the problem? And she said, well, to me, the difference between teaching in person and teaching online is the difference between Shakespeare in the theater and Shakespeare in a movie. And that got me thinking about genre. And when I started using the word genre, teach composition, it made a lot more sense what was going on, what the problem with Zoom was. Shakespeare in the theater gives a different perspective. There's energy, there's the energy of the audience informs the production, and each show is slightly different. Shakespeare in a movie is made differently. It takes a lot longer to make a movie. But that one performance, even if it takes a year to film and then another year to edit, gives a different, much closer perspective. There's not necessarily an audience because people can watch at home. People can stop and go back and forth in a movie now, and do things that they can't do in a live performance. And when I think about my students and the live performance of a classroom versus the online performance with gamification, I get to this place where I begin to again see the problem of doing a Zoom class when one can be in person. And there is one exception to this, which I'll talk about at the end. But when we started talking about the flipped classroom, we were already sort of presaging an asynchronous type of learning. And pre-pandemic, we were talking about flipped classrooms and how that works online. So when I think about teaching online, I think about course preparation, I think about course delivery and the differences, and the genre differentiation helps me with that. And also student expectations of online learning are different. Now, 2 years post-pandemic, the students that I'm getting in my freshman and sophomore classes had been only online, and they are inured to a certain way of learning and a certain way of being online. And so their expectations need to be changed. I'm told in all the schools, except maybe Hofstra, that online courses are here to stay. And even at Hofstra, there's a place for the online learning. But to be where a student is requires a skills training on the part of the instructor. I've taken 5 of these classes, and it's taken me an entire semester before I can actually teach an online class. But it also takes a new kind of training for the student. How to be an online student needs to become part of the onboarding, to use a business term, the onboarding process of bringing students into school. And unless that happens, I think that we're doing our students a disservice. And actually, I've been trying to formulate a kind of asynchronous online course to teach students how to be online students. It's tricky, and it'll take a while. So, Zoom or no Zoom. My experience is that without that kind of onboarding, the Zoom classroom is not beneficial to students' learning experience, because what they expect of an online class, being online, is different than we as instructors expect college students to be. They can't know what they're not told. Therefore, the onboarding would work to bring them to a college level. And the Zoom experience for teachers teaching into this sort of black square void is also not the best experience that they can have. So this idea that brings me to the no Zoom area has one exception. I teach high school equivalency preparation at the Long Island Educational Opportunity Center, the LIEOC. The students there are adults. Many of them are immigrants who are learning English, and they're very motivated. They also need to be taught how to be online, but in the online, it's a Google Classroom experience. These students benefit in ways that the younger students don't because of their motivation. Their cameras are all off. They're muted most of the time. When they unmute to speak, there are kids crying in the background and all these other things that are happening. Often students are taking the class from work because they work the night shift. But we have a really good graduation rate, that is diploma getting earning rate at the LIEOC, because it brings a classroom to a set of people who wouldn't be able to actually make it to class in person because their lives and their schedules don't allow it. So that's the exception. So in conclusion, a Shakespeare play produced in a theater is differently scripted and produced than a Shakespearean play on film. And that's kind of where I started my thought process here. Students deserve the best possible learning environment that they have, and trying to mimic a theater environment on a computer or a screen environment doesn't produce the best kind of learning, partly because the students aren't prepared to be as self-reliant as they need to be online. And online classes, which were being introduced and debated before the COVID pandemic, were set back at least 2 years, if not more, by the pandemic and by what we were forced to do to keep education moving. Now, as we move forward, I've been thinking about the metaphor of filmmaking to online asynchronous learning, with the caveat that students need to be onboarded before they're allowed to take classes. And this kind of means rethinking a little bit about the pre-college educational experience. And I'm told that in some places it happens, but I don't see it when students walk into my composition class or into my first year literature classes. They act as though they haven't been onboarded. So this talk has attempted to invite a rethinking of the idea of online classes in a get back to campus environment. So thanks for listening, and I guess there are questions.
Thanks, Mária. That was amazing. Very appreciated. As someone who works in an online world, that is a very thoughtful and provocative presentation. Thank you. If there are any questions, feel free to unmute yourself or put them in the chat.
Mária, this is Erin. I just wanted to jump in and just say that I really appreciate your perspective. And I also have a English humanities background, so I relate very much to the comparison there of, you know, theater versus movie, and I'm even thinking in my head about movie versus book, right? And the different experiences of the same sort of content, but in different contexts, and how that changes things, how that changes the experience for the user or the consumer, I guess. It was very interesting, and you know, we often try to kind of negotiate how we're going to do things given what's at our disposal, and being forced online is one thing. Having the time to prepare to transition online is another, right? Still challenges, I think, to be met in either situation. But yeah, it gives us a lot of food for thought. So I appreciate your perspective.
Thank you. I have to say, it's kind of interesting to teach the Odyssey, right? Because when you talk about the different ways of showing literature, right? The Odyssey was originally a sung poem in Greek. And so now we're kind of come full circle. It's been written, it's been translated, it's been, made into a movie and a game. But I had my students read, I assigned 2 chapters, one from book 1 and one from book 2 of the Odyssey, and have them read it out loud and do a presentation. And that works well online and in person, where they actually will tell the story of their chapter. And then it's like a round robin.
I like that. Yeah, we have to consider the actual translation too.
Yes.
Okay.
Should I stop sharing my screen?
Oh, sure, that's fine. Do we have any other comments, thoughts from others who have joined us today? I'm actually kind of also curious what disciplines everybody's in who joined. I just wondered if you had similar backgrounds. Ken's comment, a good idea on having students read the story. Yeah. Ken, what do you teach? I know that you've attended a couple sessions. I was just curious, what's your background? If you don't mind typing that for us. And same for Vincenzo and Patrick, if you wanted to share what areas you are in. And if you teach, I know we've had instructional designers joining the calls. We've had others, in a lot of different areas. So mathematics, fitness, personal training, exercise. Okay. Interesting. So well, mathematics too, but I was thinking in particular with Ken trying to teach that online, not just the theory piece. We've had this discussion for a long time, even in SUNY, when we are trying to prepare and work as instructional designers with faculty about designing the courses. And there's some content that naturally lends itself to that environment to be transitioned. And some of that is more what would have maybe been the lecture-based kind of material, and you could do that in a flipped way. You can do that in a lot of different ways. But like the theory, right, and in the reading, but the practical application sometimes gets a little lost in translation. And how do we engage students in their learning in meaningful ways, in ways that stick, and that sort of thing. So we even have those those conversations still, and we've been doing SUNY online, formerly Open SUNY, formerly SLN, for over 20 something years. So.
It's kind of interesting, right? That physical fitness and personal training has been around asynchronously forever. I mean, I think about all of the different people who have attempted to do their exercise programs. They're selling videos from from a long time ago. I think Jane Fonda and others like that, which is obviously it's a different kind of physical fitness training, but the idea and the delivery is sort of the same. You can stop the video, you can start it up again, just push play, that kind of thing. And it was an attempt, right, to be asynchronous. My brother teaches Spanish I'm just looking at the Italian studies. He teaches Spanish language and Spanish for business at Monmouth. And he had to keep teaching online even when everybody went back with masks, because to learn how to speak, the students needed to see his mouth moving. And so he couldn't take off his mask, and so everybody had to be asynchronous. And he's been able to do sort of remote teaching very well synchronously. He breaks students out into groups. He calls on people individually at random. He does a different kind of grading thing, and it seems to be working for him. So he's one of those people who has managed to be remote and synchronous and continues to be excited about it.
Yeah, if I can. I have to say I've been teaching online since 2013 as an adjunct at different institutions, CUNY, NYU, and so on. Now I'm full time at Farmingdale as assistant professor of Italian. There's classes that work really well synchronously online and others that don't. But the thing is, as you were saying, they need to be designed to be taught a certain way. We can't just take a class and teach it online synchronously without having a thoughtful process, redesigning basically the class completely. So I was lucky because I had a lot of experience teaching online, and once we transitioned online during the pandemic, I had training and so much experience that I knew what worked and what didn't work. Like lecturing online is, I think, totally useless. You can record a lecture or brief bursts, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and post that online and have students watch your very boring lecture. But the work that you can do synchronously has to be something else, not just sitting in front of a camera talking. So as you were saying, breakout rooms work really well, assigning quizzes, have them work on textual analysis and whatnot. And I was curious to ask you, because I thought the presentation was going to go in that direction, but maybe if you were teaching synchronously before the pandemic, right? And you're teaching synchronously now that we have resumed, face-to-face classes, if you feel that something has changed, if, I don't know, the way that students approach the online synchronous and asynchronous teaching before the pandemic and now, do you feel that something has changed, that maybe expectations or the way people are prepared?
Yes. Well, I never taught synchronously online before 2021. My online classes were all asynchronous, and it never occurred to me that there would be a time where we would be standing in front of a camera and delivering course materials live. It just didn't make any sense to me. And so then when I was told that this is what I have to do, I was like, are you sure? Really? I mean, and so I flipped the classroom a lot, where especially in my media studies class and I'm teaching US movements, social movements at Old Westbury, and they're great classes. But like you said, the lecture thing doesn't work. So they are supposed to be synchronous, but I find that I'm doing a lot of classroom flipping, where I will give students fieldwork days where they have to go out and do some other kinds of work, because they're not good at sitting in front of a live lecture, and they shouldn't be. It's not a good way to learn. What they should be doing is stopping the video and taking notes and continuing on that way. So yes, I've found that students have changed a lot. They're not as mature coming in. 2 years of pandemic has seen to that. But their expectations are also much different. They're used to watching YouTube. They and I, when we need to do something, we'll go to YouTube and figure out how to do it, and stop and start and stop and start the video until we get it done. That's how people learn. And I don't think I don't think it should change. If people want a live classroom experience, they should get that. But if they want to learn online, the remote asynchronous is the way to go. They have to be taught how to do that. But yeah, I think things have changed a lot, and hopefully we can change it for the better going forward.
Any other questions or comments?
I have a question. What is an online exercise science class?
So Ken was mentioning teaching exercise science, and my son had taken that topic in a class online. And so where he went, it was the more of the, it's the why and the how behind exercise theory and that sort of thing. And I didn't take the class, but from what I've, conversations I've had with my son, and Ken, you can talk more about what your content is, really understanding more sort of like the physics of the physicality and the movements and that sort of thing.
It's funny because when I read Ken's what he's doing, I read fitness and exercise, and then science is another line.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and you're right, kinesiology.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, and this was movement too, and he had to do, there were, he had to record himself doing the different movements.
Yeah.
And then they all share their videos. It was interesting.
Yeah. I found that sharing videos is one of the ways to get students involved. I have them read from Billy Budd and act it out, and they can do it either live themselves or they can use little puppets or whatever they want to do. But yeah, there's a lot you can do with the technology, and it's exciting to do it, but not necessarily live on camera. This works. We're in a conference. This is what Zoom is supposed to be for. But the sharing of ideas, unfortunately, or it's just the way it is, isn't the same as teaching undergraduates.
So Ken's comment reminded me of a professor that I worked with who taught in teacher education, and they would have, the students, when they were doing their field placements, they would record a lesson, and then they would come back over Zoom, watch this lesson, and be able to stop and start. And the person who taught it would be the person leading the Zoom session to get feedback from their peers on how they did. And so they sort of analyzed the video together and learned that way, here's a suggestion for this part, or how you dealt with this student, or how you delivered this content. So it's interesting to use the tool to facilitate that dialogue.
Absolutely. Before I was a teacher, I was a psychotherapist, and one of the things we had to do for couples therapy training was record the session and do exactly what you're saying. And things like that are perfect for a Zoom, but it's more, again, it's more of a peer relationship, not, it's not the same kind of teaching experience as students at an undergraduate level need. And yet they can be taught how to do it and do it well. I mean, I imagine that some of those videos that Ken's students did were great. But I'd like to know what the setup of that is before they can actually get to the point of making that video.
All right, it seems like we're winding up here. I want to thank Mária for joining us today and sharing her expertise, and all the participants for tuning in and asking questions. I wanted to also say that recordings for this and slides will be available at the website I just put in the chat at some point. And Aaron, I think you can stop the recording.